Alright, now for this last video, let's start by talking about science and industry during the Industrial Revolution. So if you want to put a subheading of science and industry. Now, there's really only one person that's very notable during the latter part of the Industrial Revolution as far as Britain's time frame, but right during the main part of it in America's time frame. And this person's an American, and he's named Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison is a very famous inventor. He makes many things that help during the Industrial Revolution, help the average person, not just industry. He makes things like the phonograph. He's most famous for developing the tungsten filament light bulb. He didn't invent the light bulb itself, but he made the tungsten filament light bulb. And the tungsten filament light bulb is what a lot of light bulbs are today. Now they're being phased out for the CFL bulbs, but before that, light bulbs burned out very quickly. And Edison tried many things, hundreds of different things inside of a light bulb before he came across tungsten as the thing that would emit light without breaking, because it's a very thin wire, it's a filament. And tungsten it's able to take the heat and still emit light without breaking or burning out very quickly. So anyway, as far as science and industry go, Thomas Edison made lots of different inventions that helped industry, but some that also helped the average person during the Industrial Revolution. Now let's talk about the consequences of industrialism. There were many consequences to the Industrial Revolution, and one of the biggest criticisms against the Industrial Revolution is the fact that there were poor living and working conditions for people during the revolution. The problem was that many people came to cities at once to work. The factories started booming. They were hiring lots of people. Factories were springing up everywhere. And people were coming in Great Britain and in America to work in these factories. Well, they needed places to live. However, they didn't find very good housing arrangements. So this is where tenement housing comes into play, and tenement houses weren't a good place to live. They were very poor places to live, and sometimes there was such a shortage of living space that people would actually live in a tenement house in rotation. So there might be three people, three different families, or two different families that would live in one actual house or one apartment. And one group would live, like they would actually come in and they would sleep, while the other person or the other group were away working. And so they would actually sleep in this tenement house in rotation because there was such a housing shortage. Or you'd have large numbers of people living in a very small, cramped area as far as living conditions. Now, working conditions, some people would be forced to work 14 or 16-hour days on a regular basis. Now, with the 8-hour workday we have today, that would be called working a double. You'd be working a double shift. And a lot of times you get compensated extra for working overtime or working a double shift. Well, back during the height of the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't a double shift, that was a regular shift. So you would go into work, you'd work 16 hours, you'd come home, you'd have to eat and sleep, and then you'd get up and you'd do it all over again. Well, that leaves, if you work 16 hours, just 8 hours in the day to do things like go to and from work, whether you walk or drive, to eat your meals and to get your sleep and get up and work the next day. And aside from the long work hours in a lot of the factories, working conditions weren't all that safe. People that worked in the coal mines were poorly ventilated. People suffered from things like black lung, where they would breathe in a lot of coal dust, and over time that was very hard on their lungs. There would be cave-ins sometimes, even in the factories. The machines are dangerous during this time period. They're still dangerous today in a lot of factories, but it wasn't uncommon for people to lose fingers or hands or arms. It wasn't uncommon for women working in factories to get chunks of hair ripped out if they had long hair and it got caught in a machine. So one of the criticisms is the working conditions were very poor and it was dangerous for the worker. Another thing is that the living conditions were not all that good. So those are two major criticisms during the Industrial Revolution. So let's talk about some positive things in the Industrial Revolution. We talked about some criticisms. Some of the positive things were that there was more productivity, so more things were being produced. And really, during the Industrial Revolution, even though working conditions may have been bad, people were better nourished because of the agricultural revolution that happened beforehand. People actually were eating better and were getting more nutritious meals, better vitamins and minerals and things like that into their diets. Also, there was a higher standard of living, so people's wages were rising during this time period. They may not have been able to afford good housing, or they may not have been able to find good housing at least. However, the wages were rising, so the standard of living was going up. And you're going to see, when we get later into this chapter, wages rise on a very, very high level to the point where people are able to just buy random things. Toward the end of the Industrial Revolution, you're going to see later in the chapter, the average middle class family just ends up buying trinkets. They actually make a special table for these trinkets during the Industrial Revolution because the people that are buying these things they don't need to have something to put them on. So that's how high the standard of living is going to rise. People go from not being able to afford things to having extra money, so they just buy stuff and they have to actually make a special table for the stuff that they don't need that they end up buying. Another thing is that population increases dramatically. So in Europe, the population in 1800 is about 190 million people. In Europe, by 1900, the population is 460 million people. And population increases because there's more food available and people are able to afford to start families sooner because of the higher standard of living. So they're having families sooner. Another positive byproduct is cities are growing. So in England, in 1840, or prior to 1840, just before 1840, there were only 2 cities that had over 100,000 people in them. So later, when we're talking about like 1900, so the year 1900, there are close to 40 cities with 100,000 people in them. And really, the urbanization is all driven by industrialism. It's driven by the fact that there are factories being built in these various cities, and then people have to move there. And you're going to see a trend later in the chapter of urbanization where before people used to live out in the country in rural areas. And the Industrial Revolution causes people to start moving into cities where eventually the majority of the population, over 50%, is going to start living in cities toward the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. So for your last subheading for today, it's going to be evaluation of the industrial age. So we're just going to take a look at overall, was it good, was it bad, were conditions better or worse as a result of it? So one of the criticisms that we talked about was that there are poor living and working conditions for the people in the factories, people in the industrialized areas. But if you look at it realistically, conditions weren't a whole lot better in rural areas sometimes. People lived in rundown homes in some rural areas. People had trouble finding work in some rural areas, and at least with industrialization, they were able to find a job a lot of times in the cities. But anyway, overall, if we're evaluating, were things better or worse as a result of industrialization? People will say, well, look at the poor living conditions and working conditions. Well, if you look at people in rural areas, you see a lot of times poor living and working conditions. People had to work dangerous jobs. Farming, there are a lot of farming accidents. If you look at today even, if you look at farming and you look at the number of accidents versus other professions, there are a lot of farming accidents and it can be dangerous. You'll see every once in a while, once or twice a year in the news, you'll see people that are injured in very tragic farming accidents. And this happened back during the industrial age as well. So you see people being injured in factories, but people also being injured in farming accidents. You see people having poor living arrangements as a result of industrialization and people having poor living arrangements in rural areas. So really, that criticism isn't valid. Now, another thing, let's look at job situations here. Industrialization provides a lot of jobs for a lot of people. So people that were no longer needed as a result of the agricultural revolution, you have a lot of farmers that are out of work. Well, what provides jobs for them? Industrialization. So as far as that's concerned, it's a very positive thing because you would have had much higher unemployment in Great Britain, and if you look at America, in America as well, if you look at other areas of Europe, as the agricultural revolution starts catching up with everyone, you're going to see more unemployed farmhands and more farmers that can't keep up with the bigger farming businesses that are growing. So industrialization provides employment for those people that otherwise would have been unemployed. So that's another good thing as a result of industrialism. Now, we're going to see later, as a result of industrialism, things like alcoholism start to rise, particularly among unmarried working men that are industrial workers. And some people make the argument that some of the seedier things, like some of the bad things that go on in urban areas, were a result of industrialization. Now, you can't necessarily make that argument. However, industrialization did have some bad aspects to it that are associated with urbanization. Also, an argument can be made that materialism resulted from industrialization. And if we look back just a few minutes in the video where I talked about people were just buying things they didn't even need because they had the money to do it, that's a bit materialistic. And they wouldn't have had the money to do that had the Industrial Revolution not happened. So your book makes the case that material goods started taking precedence over spiritual matters. So that can be a criticism leveled against it. But overall, if we look at it and we weigh the Industrial Revolution and the Industrial Age in a balance, I think there were a lot of good aspects to it. There were some bad aspects to it. But if we're looking at it overall, it was, I would argue, a positive thing. There was a lot of good that came out of it. So we're going to end here today, and you're going to have a worksheet to do now, and you'll do that, and it'll be due for homework if you don't get it done in class. And then we'll reconvene for another video lesson in the near future.